Welcome back to another episode of Gamma 21, where we're taking a journey of faith down that road from a letter written by the Apostle James. All right, a faith that actually works. Let's pray. Father, Lord, we ask that you speak to us. Hear our voice as we beseech you for your knowledge, that it may transform the way we live, we think, and we act. For Jesus' sake, we ask. Amen. Study 15. Something that's very relevant to all of us. The perils of materialism. Something that affects every single one of us in the church today. There's no escaping from this. And this passage is actually a warning to us. James chapter 5 verses 1 to 6. It was Jimmy Carter, the American president, who is a Baptist believer years ago, who actually said, human identity is no longer founded on what one does, but on what one owns, which is actually ironic. The perils of materialism, there are 5 points. God will hear the cries of the poor and hold the rich accountable for their oppression of the poor. Their ill-gotten wealth will be lost. Their wealth becomes a liability on Judgment Day. The pursuit of wealth is a deadly distraction in the last days. Materialism dehumanizes the rich and oppresses the poor. Now, firstly, God will hear the cries of the poor and hold the rich accountable for their oppression of the poor. Come now, rich, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded, your corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat up your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. This is a prophetic warning to rich Christians within the church itself who had been engaging in unethical practices. It is a rhetoric of judgment. And this particular part of the letter, the audience is basically twofold. The rich, come down, you rich, weep and howl. They're the landowners who are believers. And what they're actually doing is oppressing other church members who are basically crying out to God because they've been oppressed. So this is the twofold audience, twofold purpose where James writes these things. All right, so what have they done? Well, the wages of the laborers have mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts, which means they are defrauding their workers. They mowed their lawn, they cut their harvest, but they don't get paid. Right? And verse 6 says, you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He doesn't resist you. So this is basically hyperbole. All right? Oppression is cast as murder. And this is not uncommon because you go back in biblical literature, oppression is often cast as murder. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes, when God won't basically accept your sacrifices. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. So it's basically murder. Isaiah 121. How the faithful city has become a whore. She was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. So here, the people in Jerusalem have become murderers because they've all oppressed the poor. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and run after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless and the widow's cause and do not come to them. Corruption, thieves. Who are in charge? People in government. And this is not a different situation to what we see today. And here is some data that shows that the corruption level in Malaysia jumped up from 14% in 2014 to 30% in 2016. We've lost 47 billion GDP value to corruption alone in those years. And here's Grace Lee who is the head of the Monash University, Malaysia Department of Economics. She says, corruption is no doubt Malaysia's most critical systemic issue that leads to uneven wealth distribution, compromising the education, quality of education and healthcare, leading to an overall lower standard for Malaysians, for living for Malaysians. It's reported by Al Jazeera, 25th of November 2022. In fact, Anwar, within the first few days of his inauguration, actually said we actually have a debt of 1.5 trillion ringgit. A lot of that lost through corruption. They should have known better. Leviticus says, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. They know Leviticus is a cash flow issue. When you actually have a worker, when he's finished his wages, you should pay him straight away rather than wait for months or years before he gets paid. Deuteronomy says, Deuteronomy 24:15, you shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets. For he's poor and he counts on it. Basically, it's cash flow. Lest he cries against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. So it is a personal sin by many of the rich landowners within that particular church who actually is rich squeezing the poor. All right? And it's literally like murder. This is the death railway, which the Japanese did and took many Malaysians. Almost 30,000 Malaysians were taken and captured and made to work in this horrible railway all the way to Myanmar, and many people died. And then what happens is that the families of these 30,000 Malaysians who died during Japanese occupation have been waiting for compensation. And in fact, there's a publication that showed that the Japanese embassy had actually given money. It was over $200 million to the government in 2004 for these 30,000 Malaysians. And they would have each received 1 or 2 million each. But since then, many of the laborers have died. Very few people are still alive. So in a sense, it's a double murder. By the Japanese, and two, by our own government. For 20 years, they deprived the recompensation which was due to these people. There's a story told of a bunch of Christians who lived in a mountain. And what happens, there was a very big, winding, treacherous road going up the mountain. And often, because it was so winding and treacherous, many of the cars would go over the side. There would be accidents. And what the Christians did in that particular town was get together and actually created a 24-hour ambulance service where they actually went to save many lives. But many lives, because of the accident and the depth of the fall, were crippled for life. And then the young Christians came into the town and started to look at this and suggested, why don't we build a tunnel right across through the mountain so they don't have to go to this winding road? That will solve the problem and we don't have to rescue so many people. And then the townsfolk got to him and said, no, we can't do this. You know why? Because the mayor of the town actually owns a restaurant and a rest house or hotel halfway up the mountain. If you build this tunnel, he will lose business and he's not going to agree with it. So why don't we talk to him? Well, as Christians, because he's also the elder of the church. So you can't persuade him otherwise. And the poor, the young Christians say, why don't you vote in a new elder or vote in a new mayor? Oh, we can't do that. Church cannot get involved in politics. And so therefore we should leave it alone. We should just concentrate on sending ambulances to pick people up. This is an example of institutionalized injustice, where the whole system created by rich people actually is used to oppress poor people. And it is not enough to basically help the poor. It is also important to ensure that they're not oppressed in our political system, where we have to actually make systemic changes. God will always demand accountability in the end. He says, you rich, yes. Apparently God is quiet for now. Weep and howl because the misery is going to come. And he will always hear. He will demand accountability. He says, the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord. He will always hear. When Cain killed Abel, the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me. This is basically symbolic language, metaphorical language. God hears every single innocent soul that's being oppressed or murdered or cheated, God will hear and God will exact punishment. All right, that's number one, the warning. Number two, that ill-gotten gain will be lost. Your riches have been rotted. Your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. In those days, riches are stored either as fine, beautiful clothes or as silver and gold. All of these will be corroded, and your corrosion will be evidence against you, and you'll eat your flesh like fire. You laid up treasure in the last days. So the word for corrosion in Greek is eos, and it means rusted or corroded, but the same word is actually used as poison, which is basically, it's homonymous, which means words that have different meaning, but pronounced the same way or spelt the same. And this is used here where your gold and silver have corroded. It's also used in James chapter 3 when it says, the tongue is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. So what he means is basically their wealth will be their poison. It will be what destroys them. So corrosion is a metaphor for judgment day. All that they've saved up is actually useless. There's no net gain. The wealth has been the one that poisons them, which is the same is in James chapter 1 verses 9 to 11. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, the rich in his humiliation, because the flower, like the flower of the grass, he will pass away. The sun rises with his scorching heat and withers the grass, its flowers fall and its beauty perishes. So will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. So wealth does not last. In fact, the rich should be embarrassed because they spent all their time in useless pursuits, right? Now, Jeremiah chapter 2, has the nation changed its gods? Or even though they have no gods, my people have exchanged their glory for things which does not profit. The whole trouble is corrosion. It's a loss of perceived value. It poisons their life. He who loves money, in Ecclesiastes, will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income, and this is also vanity. So not only that, the corrosion will also cause them to be addicted. 1 Timothy 6:9 says, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. This is the poison of materialism in our lives. This is Tim Casser, who is an expert in specializing in materialism and well-being. He's a professor of psychology at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And he actually summarized the research of the American Association of Psychologists and have said that materialism causes people to be competitive, manipulative, selfish, and less empathetic. There are lower levels of well-being, less pro-social, interpersonal behavior, the spending problems and debt, and unpleasant emotions like depression and anxiety, stomach aches and headaches, and a lack of satisfaction in life. In fact, there was a study of 2,500 people who were followed up for 6 years, published by Rick Peters and his group at the Journal of Consumer Research, and they found that materialism, the more materialistic you were, the more isolated you were, and the more isolated you are, the more materialistic you are. So it's a vicious cycle. 2008 to 2011, Iceland experienced economic disaster. It was a crisis. Many people lost money. And as a result of that, there are two groups of people that happened to come out of this crisis. One became more materialistic because they want to gain back what they lost. And the others became less materialistic because they were so fed up with saving all the money and all money lost within a blink of an eye. And with these two groups, they actually noticed this group less well-being, this group fared emotionally, psychologically much better. Here's another study by Psychological Science that looked at 18-year-olds and they asked them to rank what they thought of jobs, money and status versus self-acceptance, fellow feeling and belonging to others. They did this questionnaire to look at the levels of materialism. And they repeated the same questionnaire 12 years later when they are 30 years of age, retested them. And then they found that those who were more materialistic were less happy and had more mental disorders than those who were less materialistic. You see, that the treasures of the world, materialism actually corrodes. All right? There was a church program that taught children, teenagers, away from spending and materialism and move them towards sharing and saving. And the data found from this particular church program showed that yes, materialism increased, self-esteem went down. So therefore, these are the perils of materialism. It will be lost, and there are a lot of psychological effects which you will find in a world where you live with materialism as the number one goal in your life. Third thing is that their wealth will become a liability on the judgment day. Come now, you rich, weep and poor. Now, let's go to verse 3. Your gold and silver have corroded. The corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Wow. See, your wealth will be a liability on judgment day. Here is Revelation 14. It says, the dead can rest from the labors and their deeds will follow them. The only thing that will bring them across is their deeds. It's like having a scale, and the only scale that matters is basically righteous deeds and not materials. Here's Rosma supposed to have this ring, $97 million ring bought for her by the husband who is now basically in jail. And as she goes for trial, there was a US trial on this particular topic because this ring was bought from New York, from a very famous jeweler called Lorraine Schwartz, who actually creates rings for the stars, Beyonce and everybody else in Hollywood. And the jury in the US was shown an invoice of Rosma's $97 million pink diamond, which Najib claims she never received. But the invoice was evidence. You can't run. On the last day before God, all that riches that we actually have will be evidence against us. You see, we laid up treasure on the last day. James 5:5 says, you lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You fattened your heart in a day of slaughter, which means the treasure that you build up is actually evidence against you. You're like fatted. It's like having the Wagyu beef. You know Wagyu beef and Kobe beef in Japan? They're so well pampered. They are not allowed to roam around. They're given the best food. They're given best care. There's music. They basically have massages. They win prizes. Each cow is worth $30,000 US. And what happens? They're there for slaughter. So if you live in luxury, that luxury is a testimony to the fact that you're building up all that punishment which God is going to unleash on you one day. So their wealth will become a liability on the last day because God is going to ask you, what did you do with the wealth? So let's recap. God will hear the cries of the poor and hold the rich accountable for their oppression of the poor. Their ill-gotten wealth will be lost. Their wealth will become a liability on Judgment Day when God will ask them what they did with that wealth. And fourthly, the pursuit of wealth is a deadly distraction in the last days. All right? Your gold and silver have corroded. You have laid up treasure in the last days. It's very important because laying up treasure in a context of the last days is basically very important. It's different from the first few days. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. Imagine we have a basketball game and through the rest of the game you're playing very hard, and the last few minutes of the game and we are 3 points down, what they do is start walking around and doing something else other than throwing the basket. That is what's happening. The pursuit of wealth is a deadly distraction in the last days. Here you actually have the Japanese occupation of Malaya many years ago. And what they did was they actually printed banana notes because of the banana tree on them. They actually call them banana notes. And and they even have bigger and bigger notes, $1,000 notes. And by 1945, they actually printed $4 trillion of banana notes. And imagine in 1945, and you spend all the time trying to earn as much banana notes as possible, and then suddenly Japan collapses and all the banana notes are worth nothing. And what happens is that the creation of the banana notes becomes a distraction. The earning of the banana notes becomes a distraction in an inappropriate dash to earn them in the last days, right? So imagine, then I considered my hands had done and the toil I expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So in the end, if I'm trying very hard, in the end, nothing to be gained. This is in Klondike gold rush in Alaska. It was in 1896 to 1899 when everybody rushed there. Hundreds of thousands of people rushed up to Alaska to dig for gold. And there was a story told of two miners who were very successful. They were getting a lot of gold, and it was just before the onset of winter. And the more gold that they actually dug out and accumulated, the more excited they were. And they forgot that winter was just around the corner. And finally, winter came. And they were totally unprepared. They didn't have the right clothes. They didn't have the right provisions. All they were doing was constantly digging more and more gold, which they actually got. And when they found these two men later on, they found a piece of paper which they had written, and both men totally frozen to death, lying on top of a pile of gold. And the note that they actually wrote expressed regret that they actually spent their last few days on the wrong thing. Instead of getting provisions, they were digging for more and more gold. And they got what they wanted. They died with the gold lying on top of the gold, which was absolutely useless. The last point about the dangers of materialism is that it dehumanizes the rich and oppresses the poor. You live in earth, in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fatted your heart for the day of slaughter. You condemn and murder the righteous man. He does not resist you. So basically what he does is that basically he paints a contrast between the rich, basically live in absolute luxury and self-indulgence, and then the poor was so in distress, and yet they don't retaliate. And it's exactly what happened in Jesus' parable of the poor beggar called Lazarus, who's basically living outside the rich man's house, and all he gets is scraps which the dogs eat, and then he actually sees the poor beggar every single day he passes by, and he does nothing because he cannot see him. And then when he dies, the fortunes are actually reversed. So what happens with materialism? Materialism makes us insensitive to our fellow human being. We live in abject luxury and self-indulgence, causing us to walk past the poor who have got nothing. So therefore, in a sense, it dehumanizes the rich. God created us, and Randy Alcorn writes, God created us to love the poor, the people and use things. But materialists love things and use people. Materialism is first and foremost a matter of the heart. Amos says, he basically condemns the rich. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Here is the people who love. You're supposed to love people and use things. Here the materialists love things and use people. They will sell the poor for just a pair of sandals. And this is what happens when people do not honor God. Romans, Paul says, because they don't know God, they do not honor Him as God or give thanks, they become futile in their thinking. Foolish hearts became darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. So our minds become corrupted and changed, and we worship the wrong thing. When we worship money and materials, we actually cease to be truly human. Because to be human is to be made in the image of God, to reflect God, to represent God, and to relate to God, to be truly human. And when we actually treat other human beings as materials or an instrument to gain more material, then we actually cease to be truly human. And this cannot work out, because if you look with time, this is a graph showing the happiness level. good things will happen, and then bad things happen, we feel very sad. Good things will happen, we feel happy, but we won't be quite as happy as what we were before. The peak is lower, but the trough is also lower, and bad things happen because everything moves towards the median, the baseline of happiness. And to prove this point, we can see here's a graph of consumption and happiness. Here's the average income in the United States from 1955 to 2005. The income goes up, but the happiness levels basically stays the same. And not only that, the worst thing about riches is that it's actually told to us by a French philosopher many, many years ago in 1754. He says, since these conveniences or these riches or these luxuries, by becoming habitual, because we keep on having it. If you have caviar every day, you got Wagyu beef every day, they become habitual, had almost entirely ceased to be enjoyable. At the same time, degenerated into true needs. It became more and more cruel to be deprived of them than possess them was sweet. And men were unhappy to lose them without being happy to possess them. So imagine if you woke up every day and you had Wagyu beef every single day, right? After a while, because of desensitization, our happiness level will not be as high on the 15th time you eat Wagyu beef as the first time. And that's a fact, we all see that. But if you take the Wagyu beef away, then we'll be terribly unhappy, which means we become addicted. And that is the sad, sad result of materialism. It makes us less than human when we start to treat other people as things. May God add this warning to all of our hearts. May His name be glorified.